Edmund Pryce's walking stick was found on the left side of the stile. That was the detail. For 41 years, every person in Chipping Barrow had watched him cross Rookery Path with that stick planted firmly in his right hand, the left shoulder having been near useless since the war. He could not reach across his own body to set it down on the left. He had not done so. The stick had been placed there by someone who did not know which hand he favoured. Someone who had never actually watched him walk. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where the quietest corners of England conceal the most deliberate of sins. Tonight's case takes us to a damp autumn morning on Rookery Path, where a man known for never varying his routine was found to have varied it, fatally, for the very last time. This is Miss Marple Solves the Rookery Path Murder. Chapter 1. The Morning Walk. The body of Edmund Pryce was discovered at 8:07 on a Thursday morning in October by Mrs. Dolly Fitch, who had gone to collect mushrooms from the lower field, and had taken the long way round through Rookery Path, as she always did when her knees were troubling her, and the gradient of Church Lane felt unwelcome. She almost stepped on him. He was lying just beyond the second stile, the one with the loose hinge that the parish council had been promising to repair since the previous spring, on his back, arms at his sides in a posture that was almost composed, almost restful, were it not for the bruising along the left temple, and the particular stillness that belongs only to the irreversibly dead. His hat had come off and rested a foot away, crown side down in the mud. His eyes were closed. Mrs. Fitch, to her credit, did not scream. She was 67 years old and had grown up on a farm. She stood very still for a moment, set down her basket with some care, and walked briskly back toward the village to fetch Constable Marsh. By 9 o'clock, Chipping Barrow had arranged itself into its customary response to catastrophe. The Women's Institute appeared to have convened without formal notice at the post office. The vicar, Reverend Aubrey Spence, was standing in the lane outside his gate with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression caught between pastoral gravity and human curiosity. And Mrs. Adela Pryce, the dead man's wife of 38 years, had been informed of her husband's death by a young constable who had clearly never done it before, and had handled the task with the blunt efficiency of someone reading from a list. She had not wept. She had asked 3 questions: where, when, and was it certain, and had then asked to be left alone, which request was immediately ignored by her sister-in-law, who arrived within 12 minutes, carrying a fruitcake. Miss Jane Marple had heard the news from her garden wall. She had been examining her Michaelmas daisies with the focused dissatisfaction of a woman who suspects she has planted them 6 inches too far to the left, when young Tommy Blaine had come cycling past and shouted it over the hedge with the cheerful urgency of a boy who has not yet learned that some information requires a measured delivery. "Mr. Pryce is dead on Rookery Path, Miss Marple. Police are there now." She had thanked him, noted the time, 20 minutes past 9, and gone inside to put the kettle on. Inspector Dennis Colford arrived from Barrowbridge shortly before noon, with a sergeant called Hewitt, who wrote everything down in a very small notebook, and seemed mildly irritated by the whole enterprise. Colford was 52, competent in the way that long practice produces competence, and possessed of the particular certainty that village matters, however unpleasant, were seldom genuinely complicated. He had worked 4 rural cases in his career. 3 had resolved themselves into accidents. The 4th had been the husband. He walked Rookery Path twice, spoke to Mrs. Fitch at length. He examined the position of the body, as it had been described to him. It had since been removed, and stood for some time looking at the stile with the loose hinge. The walking stick had already been noted in the constable's report. Found leaning against the left-hand post of the stile, approximately 2 feet from where the deceased was lying. Colford had read it without particular interest. A man falls ill, or is struck, drops his stick, manages a few more steps. The stick ends up where it ends up. These things were rarely as geometrically tidy as detective novels suggested. He would have the post-mortem report by evening. He expected it to confirm a blow to the head from a fall. The path was uneven, the October mud treacherous, with some remote possibility of foul play that would likely amount to nothing. He was not, in other words, thinking carefully about the stick. Miss Marple arrived at the Pryce house at 2:30, carrying a jar of her damson preserve, and wearing the expression of mild concern that served her well in most social crises. Sympathetic without being intrusive, present without being pressuring. She had known Adela Pryce for 19 years, not intimately, but with the particular texture of village acquaintance that means one knows a great deal without having been directly told any of it. Adela was in the sitting room. She was a tall, composed woman of 61, with grey hair and the sort of face that had once been handsome and was now merely controlled. She thanked Miss Marple for the preserves with automatic precision and poured tea without being asked, which told Miss Marple something. "It must be a very great shock," Miss Marple said, "even when one has had time to prepare." Adela looked up from the teapot. "I don't know what you mean by that." Only that Edmund's health had been uncertain, hadn't it, for some months. Miss Marple settled her cup into its saucer. "I recall seeing him at the harvest supper and thinking he looked rather tired. He had his heart." Adela sat down. "The doctor said it could go at any time." "Ah," Miss Marple nodded gently. "That is quite a weight to carry for both of you." There was a pause. Outside, a wood pigeon called twice from the garden and then stopped. "He went out every morning," Adela said eventually, as if explaining something to herself. "Every single morning since we were married, he walked Rookery Path at 7. He said it was the only hour when it was truly quiet." She set her cup down on the table beside her with great precision, centering it on its saucer. "He would never have gone any other way." Miss Marple said nothing to that. She merely looked, as she so often did, at nothing in particular. At the fireplace, at the mantelpiece clock, at the framed photograph beside it of a younger Edmund Pryce in what appeared to be a garden somewhere distinctly warmer than Chipping Barrow. "What a very long marriage," she said finally, in the same pleasant, inconsequential tone she might have used to comment on the weather. And she filed away, for later consideration, the fact that Adela Pryce had used the past tense, "it could go at any time," in a way that suggested she had been thinking about that sentence for rather longer than this afternoon. Chapter 2. What the Village Knew. By the following morning, Chipping Barrow had formed 3 distinct opinions about the death of Edmund Pryce, and each of them was wrong in a different direction. The first and most popular held that it had been an accident entirely, that Edmund's heart, long suspected of unreliability, had simply chosen Thursday morning on a muddy path to make its final complaint. This view was championed principally by Reverend Spence, who preferred natural explanations as a matter of professional temperament, and by Dr. Lawrence Quill, the village physician, who had been managing Edmund's cardiac condition for 3 years and felt, with some defensiveness, that the post-mortem would confirm what he had always privately expected. The second opinion, held in quieter corners and with more relish, and was that Edmund Pryce had not been a universally beloved figure, and that the list of people who might have wished him harm was longer than the parish council's minutes would ever officially reflect. This view had no single champion. It circulated instead, the way ungenerous truths always do, in fragments. A raised eyebrow at the post office, a lowered voice in the butcher's, a significant pause before someone changed the subject. The third opinion belonged exclusively to Mrs. Dolly Fitch, who had found the body and had therefore appointed herself the primary authority on its significance. She believed with increasing conviction that the rookery itself was involved, that the old copse at the path's northern end had always attracted an unsavoury element, and that one day something of this nature was bound to happen. And she had said so in 1987. She had said so again in 2003. She felt, not without satisfaction, that she had been proved correct. Inspector Colford, who was not interested in any of these three opinions, received his post-mortem report at 8:45 on Friday morning. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the left temporal region. The blow had been delivered with considerable force from a slightly elevated angle, consistent, the pathologist noted carefully, with a right-handed assailant standing above and behind the victim, or alternatively with a fall against a hard surface at an awkward angle. There was no cardiac episode. Edmund Pryce's heart, it turned out, had been in perfectly reasonable condition for a man of 73. Colford read this twice, set the report on his desk, and reached for his telephone. Miss Marple spent Friday morning at the village library, which was open between 10 and 1 on Tuesdays and Fridays, and was staffed by a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Vera Lamb, who read everything and remembered most of it. Miss Marple had found over many years that libraries in small towns were not primarily about books. They were about the accretion of local knowledge in one convenient location. She borrowed 2 novels she had no intention of reading and spent 40 minutes in conversation. What she learned was this: Edmund Pryce had 18 months prior applied to the District Planning Authority to have the public footpath designation of Rookery Path formally reviewed. If successful, the application would have reclassified a significant stretch of the route as private land, land which happened to adjoin the Pryce property on its eastern boundary. 3 households used Rookery Path regularly. Several more used it occasionally. The application had caused considerable feeling. He said it was a safety issue, Mrs. Lamb said, straightening a shelf of local history guides that did not require straightening. The stile, the mud in winter, the liability, but everyone knew it was the Armitage boy. Edmund never forgave him for the business with the fence. The fence, Miss Marple repeated, as though she were only mildly interested in fences as a general subject. 3 years ago, perhaps 4. Young Marcus Armitage, well, not so young now, he must be 30, put up a post and wire fence along the top field boundary. Edmund said it encroached 6 inches onto his land. Marcus said it didn't. The surveyor they brought in was inconclusive, which satisfied nobody. Mrs. Lamb lowered her voice slightly, though they were alone in the building. Edmund reported him to the council twice. Then there was something about planning permission for Marcus's workshop. Edmund wrote to object. It became rather unpleasant. These boundary disputes, Miss Marple said pleasantly, have a way of becoming about something else entirely, don't they? Something that happened long before the fence. Mrs. Lamb considered this with the expression of someone who agrees completely, but hasn't previously found the words for it. I suppose they do. Edmund was not. He was not a man who forgot. Once he felt wronged, he held it. Iadella always managed him rather better than he managed himself in those situations, I always thought. Miss Marple thanked her, collected her borrowed novels, and walked home by way of the long route, not through Rookery Path, which was still cordoned with police tape, but along the lane that skirted the Armitage property. Marcus Armitage was in his yard when she passed, loading timber into a van with the focused economy of a man who works alone and prefers it. He was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and somewhere between 30 and 35, the sort of young man who looked permanently as though he had just come in from weather. He glanced up as Miss Marple walked by. She gave him the small, vague smile she reserved for people she was not yet ready to speak to directly, and continued on. He watched her for a moment, but then went back to his timber. Miss Marple noted, without expression, that his yard gate, solid, well-maintained, recently oiled by the look of the hinges, opened onto a path that ran directly north, toward the rookery, toward the upper stile. She also noted that he was loading timber into a van on a Friday morning with rather more efficiency than the task required. Men who are merely busy do not move like that. Men who are thinking about something else do. Constable Marsh, to his credit, had spent Thursday afternoon making a list of everyone known to use Rookery Path regularly. It contained 7 names. Inspector Colford, arriving that afternoon with revised instructions and a narrowed expression, added 3 more based on Marsh's subsequent interviews, and quietly set aside the theory of accidental death. He did not, as yet, set aside any names. But he began for the first time to think carefully about the walking stick. Chapter 3. The Questions People Ask. Inspector Colford conducted his interviews at the village hall, which smelled of old wood and institutional tea, and had a table long enough to seat 20, but which now held only 2 chairs, placed opposite one another with the careful asymmetry of a room arranged to make one person feel slightly more exposed than the other. He began with the obvious ones. Marcus Armitage arrived 7 minutes late, which Colford noted without comment. He was the kind of man who filled a room not through any effort of personality, but simply through physical presence. Broad across the shoulders, quiet in his movements, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that speaking first rarely serves him. He sat down, placed both hands flat on the table, and waited. Colford asked him when he had last seen Edmund Pryce. "Tuesday," Marcus said. "In the lane. We didn't speak." "Did you often not speak?" "We hadn't spoken since February. He filed another objection to my workshop extension. I saw no reason to pretend that was acceptable. And Thursday morning, between 6 and 9. In my yard, loading a delivery. Anyone with you?" A pause that was fractionally too long. "No." Colford wrote something in his notebook that Marcus could not read from across the table. "Mr. Armitage, how often do you use Rookery Path?" "I don't. Not since Edmund applied to have it reclassified. I use the lane. Always, always." He said it without emphasis, which was, Colford thought, precisely the way a careful man would say something he needed to be believed. The second interview was with a woman named Patricia Doyle, who had lived in Chipping Barrow for 11 years, and occupied the end cottage on Marsh Lane, the one whose rear garden backed directly onto the Rookery Path's southern stretch. She was 44, a secondary school teacher of geography, on half-term. She came early, sat with her coat still buttoned, and answered every question before it was fully asked. Yes, she had heard something Thursday morning. Around 7:30, she thought. She hadn't checked the time specifically, but Farming Today had just finished on the radio, which put it at approximately that. A sound from the path side of her garden. Footsteps, she thought, though the path always had footsteps. Was there anything distinctive about these particular footsteps? Colford asked. Patricia Doyle considered this with the precision of someone who distrusts imprecision in herself. They stopped, she said. There was a gap, perhaps 2 minutes. Then they started again, but differently. Lighter, faster. She paused, as though the person had put something down. Colford looked up from his notebook. Or picked something up, she added. Miss Marple did not attend the interviews at the village hall. She had not been asked, and she was not in any official capacity involved. She was instead at home, in her sitting room, on the telephone to her nephew, Raymond's wife Claire, who had once spent a summer in Chipping Barrow as a girl, and remembered it with the selective fondness of someone who had been happy there for unrelated reasons. And the conversation lasted 20 minutes. For 15 of those minutes, Miss Marple listened. What she was listening for was not information about the case. She was listening for what Claire remembered about the Pryce family, not the facts which were available from any number of sources, but the texture of them. The way a family presents itself to temporary visitors who are young enough to be unguarded around. Edmund was always very correct, Claire said, very formal. Even with children, you know how some older men are rather easier, rather more grandfatherly. He wasn't that. He was polite, but watching, as though he was keeping score of something. And Mrs. Pryce? Oh, Adela was kind, genuinely kind. But she had that way of, you know how some women who've been managing a difficult man for years develop a sort of permanent bracing, as though they're always just about to absorb a blow. Miss Marple thanked her, expressed appropriate interest in Claire's children, and rang off. She sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the fireplace. Then she reached for her small notebook, the brown one, not the blue, and wrote 2 words in her careful, old-fashioned hand. Long before, she underlined it once. By Friday afternoon, the village had learned that the police were now treating Edmund's death as suspicious, and the 3 opinions of Thursday morning collapsed into one, which was that someone had done it deliberately, and that the police ought to look very carefully at anyone who had ever had a disagreement with Edmund Pryce. Since this description applied to a significant percentage of Chipping Barrow's adult population, the suggestion was not as useful as it felt. The Women's Institute held an emergency meeting that had not been formally called as such, but which had nonetheless achieved a quorum. Adela Pryce was not present. Her sister-in-law, a brisk woman named Constance Veal, attended in her place and reported that Adela was bearing up, was not speaking to the press, and had asked that people not come to the house without telephoning first. This instruction was almost universally ignored. Miss Marple telephoned. She was admitted at 4 o'clock and found Adela in the same chair as before, with a different expression, less controlled, more careful, which was, Miss Marple reflected, the reverse of what grief usually produced. Grief made people less careful. Whatever Adela Pryce was feeling, it was not entirely grief. No, they're saying it was deliberate, Adela said without preamble. So it appears. Miss Marple accepted tea. How very hard for you. Edmund had enemies. She said it plainly, as a statement of fact rather than a complaint. He cultivated them in his way. He was a man who needed to be in the right. The fence, the path application, the business with the Ryland planning permission 6 years ago, He could not let things alone. She looked at her tea. I told him, many times. That is a difficult thing, Miss Marple said, to watch someone make the same mistake in different shapes. Adela looked at her with an expression Miss Marple had seen before on the faces of women who have been understood without asking for it. It was not entirely comfortable. "What will you do?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Ain't you now that you are on your own?" The pause before Adela answered was 3 seconds too long for a woman who claimed to have had no warning. "I shall manage," she said. "I always have." Chapter 4. A second look at the stile, and the name nobody has yet mentioned. Chapter 4. The stile and the silence. The police tape came down on Saturday morning, and by 10 o'clock, 3 separate dog walkers had already used Rookery Path as though nothing had occurred, which was either a testament to the resilience of rural routine or a failure of imagination, depending on one's disposition. Miss Marple walked it at 10:30. She was not the sort of woman who announced her intentions, and she was not the sort of woman who required company for tasks she preferred to conduct at her own pace. She wore her good walking shoes, carried her stick, and moved along the path with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who is not, in fact, walking for exercise. The path ran roughly north from the village lane, skirted the eastern edge of the Armitage property, behind a hawthorn hedge, crossed a wooden footbridge over a narrow drainage ditch, and then rose gently toward the rookery, the small dense copse of oak and ash that gave the path its name. The first stile was 100 yards before the rookery. The second was just beyond it, where the path descended again toward the lower meadow and Mrs. Fitch's mushroom field. It was at the second stile that Edmund Pryce had been found. Miss Marple stood at the first stile and looked at it carefully before climbing it. It was solid, well-maintained, set into a dry stone wall. The step was worn smooth in the centre, many years of feet, it all landing in the same place. She crossed it without difficulty and walked into the rookery. The copse was quiet in the particular way that enclosed spaces with a recent history become quiet, not peaceful, but held. The leaves had mostly fallen. The light came through in flat grey columns. The ground was soft with accumulated damp, and she could see even now the compressed mud where a number of boots had stood, constables and pathologists, and she noted at least one person who had come and gone from the eastern side, rather than along the path itself, the eastern side, the Armitage side. She did not dwell on this. She continued to the second stile. The stile itself was the one with the loose hinge. She tested it, and it rattled convincingly under her hand. The left-hand post was set into the wall at a slight outward lean, which meant that anything rested against it would tend to slide or topple unless placed with deliberate balance. She considered this. A walking stick placed against a leaning post does not stay placed against a leaning post without effort. Edmund's stick had been found upright and stable. Someone had wedged it carefully, she thought, into the gap between the post and the wall. Not dropped, not fallen. Wedged with a moment's thought. She stood on the path side of the stile and looked down at the ground. The mud here had been considerably disturbed by official feet, but she could still make out, at the margin of the disturbance, a second set of impressions, heavier than a woman's, not as heavy as a large man's. Someone of moderate build who had stood here for some time before the police arrived, or someone who had been here earlier, for different reasons. She noted the approximate size. She noted the tread pattern, where the mud had preserved it, something with a plain sole, no pronounced heel. Work boots, possibly, or older walking shoes. She looked at them for what she judged was long enough, then crossed the stile and continued on. Below the stile, the path widened briefly before reaching the lower meadow gate. There was a flat stone set into the bank, an old marker of some kind, local limestone, and Miss Marple sat on it to rest, which she did not particularly need to do, but which gave her a reason to remain still and look back up the path toward the rookery. From this angle, she could see the second stile quite clearly. She could also see, through a gap in the hawthorn hedge to her left, a portion of the Armitage yard, the corner of the workshop building, at the edge of a timber stack. The gap was not large, but it was sufficient. Anyone standing at that gap would have a reasonable view of the stile. The reverse was also true. She thought about Patricia Doyle's testimony. The footsteps that had stopped for 2 minutes, then resumed lighter and faster. Footsteps that stopped long enough for a person to observe something, or to do something, and then move on quickly. She thought about the direction. Doyle's garden was on the southern stretch. If someone had come from the south, through the lower path, they would have passed Doyle's garden, reached the stile, done what they had come to do, and returned quickly, lighter and faster, because the purpose was accomplished. Or someone had come from the east, through the Armitage gap, and then walked south, and in which case Doyle had heard the departure, not the arrival. 2 possibilities, 1 set of footprints. Miss Marple stood up from the stone, smoothed her coat, and began walking back toward the village. There was a name she had not heard mentioned once in 3 days of careful listening, and its absence was, to her, considerably more interesting than any name that had been mentioned frequently. The name was Geoffrey Ryland. Edmund Pryce had objected to the Ryland planning permission 6 years ago. Adela herself had said it without emphasis, lumping it in with the fence and the path application as evidence of Edmund's combative nature. Mrs. Lamb had touched on it even more briefly. Nobody else had raised it at all. A man who loses a planning permission objection merely loses an objection. A man who loses what the objection was really about. And Edmund Pryce, Miss Marple was coming to understand, was always fighting about something other than the stated subject, carries it differently. She would need to know what Geoffrey Ryland had built. She would need to know what Edmund had actually been trying to prevent. And she would need, she thought, to pay a call on the Ryland household, before Inspector Colford thought to ask the same questions, and made them inaccessible by making them official. She quickened her pace slightly, which for Miss Marple meant she was thinking with some urgency. Chapter 5. The Conservatory Question. Geoffrey Ryland lived in a handsome stone house called Whitton at the northern edge of Chipping Barrow. She set back from the road behind a yew hedge and a gravel drive that announced visitors with a satisfying crunch. The house was larger than the village generally required of its residents, and had been extended twice, once legitimately, once after a prolonged and apparently bitter exchange with the district planning authority, in which Edmund Pryce had been a vocal third party. The second extension was a conservatory. It ran along the entire western face of the house, glass and pale timber, and it overlooked, with an unobstructed and rather magnificent clarity, the upper end of Rookery Path. Miss Marple stood at the Ryland gate for a moment, and absorbed this fact with the stillness of a woman rearranging furniture in her mind. Then she went up the drive. Geoffrey Ryland answered the door himself, which suggested either that he had no housekeeper or that he had seen her coming. He was 68. She had established this from Mrs. Lamb, who maintained a mental register of local birthdays with the reliability of a civic institution, with a full head of white hair, the careful posture of a man who had once been taller, and the eyes of someone who calculates before speaking. He was wearing a shirt without a tie, and had the slightly surprised expression of a person interrupted in thought. "Miss Marple," he said, not a question. Not unwelcoming, precisely, but not its opposite either. "Mr. Ryland, I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I was walking back from the path, and I thought, forgive me, I know it's rather unannounced. I simply wanted to offer my condolences about Edmund. I know you were neighbours of long standing." It was a sentence designed to be both true and imprecise, and it produced the result she had hoped for. He was not certain whether she was there as a mourner, a gossip, or something else, and uncertainty, in Miss Marple's experience, made people careful in ways that were themselves informative. "Come in," he said after a moment. The conservatory was warm and overplanted. A long table of seedlings under grow lights at the far end, staging shelves crowded with terracotta pots. A wicker chair positioned at the western window with a footstool and a folded newspaper on the arm. Someone spent a great deal of time in that chair. Someone who could see from that position the upper stile and a significant portion of Rookery Path's northern end. She accepted tea and took the chair he offered, not the wicker one, and arranged herself comfortably while he poured, using the interval to observe the room. On the staging shelf nearest the window, between two pots of overwintering pelargoniums, there was a pair of binoculars. They were not the expensive kind. They were worn and practical, and had been set down with the casually habitual placement of a frequently used object. "Bird watching?" she asked pleasantly when he sat down. He glanced at the shelf. A pause, no longer than a breath, but she marked it. "Occasionally. Nuthatches come to the oaks. I watch the rookery in autumn." "How lovely." She accepted her tea. "I imagine you saw the police on Thursday. From here, one would have quite a clear view of the commotion." "I did, eventually. I was out in the morning, back by 11. The tape was up by then." He said it without particular haste, which was the verbal equivalent of placing a walking stick against a leaning post. Carefully balanced. "Of course," Miss Marple said. "And Edmund, had you spoken recently? I know there was some difficulty, years ago, over the conservatory." Geoffrey Ryland set his cup down, with a precision that suggested he was deciding how honest to be. "The planning matter was resolved 6 years ago," he said. "Edmund objected. He was overruled. We were not on terms of warmth afterward, but we were civil. Villages require civility." "They do," Miss Marple agreed, "though Edmund's path application last year must have been concerning for you specifically. The upper section of Rookery Path runs very close to your boundary." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the look of a person who has underestimated someone and is making the rapid internal adjustment. "It would have been inconvenient," he said carefully. "I said so to the parish council." "And to Edmund directly?" Another pause, longer this time. "We spoke. In March, in the lane, briefly. I told him I found the application unreasonable. He said that was not his concern." "That sounds like Edmund," Miss Marple said, with the gentle warmth of someone paying a neutral observation. It sounds exactly like Edmund." Something shifted in his voice, not anger precisely, but the controlled residue of it. The kind that had been managed for years into a particular flat tone. She left Whitton 20 minutes later with 2 additional facts and 1 confirmed suspicion. The first fact: Geoffrey Ryland had been a land surveyor before his retirement. He would have understood the path reclassification application and its implications with a professional precision that most residents lacked. The second fact: there was a gate at the northern end of the Ryland property. She had seen it from the drive on her way out, half concealed by the yew hedge that opened onto the upper end of Rookery Path, directly onto it, 40 yards from the second stile. The confirmed suspicion: Geoffrey Ryland had been in that conservatory on Thursday morning, watching through those binoculars, and he had either seen something he was not yet prepared to share, or he had seen nothing because he had not been watching the path, and he had been watching for something else entirely. She walked home slowly, which was her way of thinking quickly. She had come to Whitton expecting to add a name to a list. She was leaving with the uncomfortable sense that the list was not the problem. The order of events was the problem. Someone had moved that stick after Edmund fell. Someone had arranged the scene. And an arrangement required time. Time meant no other witness had been there. Or it meant the only witness had arranged it themselves. No. Chapter 6. The Letter in the Bureau. It was Constance Veal who mentioned the letter, which she did on Sunday afternoon at Adela's kitchen table, while Miss Marple was present under the reliable cover of having brought soup. Constance was Edmund's younger sister, 64, angular, efficient, with the brisk, unsentimental manner of a woman who had spent 40 years as a district nurse, and had consequently seen most of what human beings were capable of producing, medically and otherwise. She had been managing Adela's household since Thursday, with the focused competence of someone who finds grief easier to bear when given a task. She had answered the telephone, redirected flowers, and organized the refrigerator according to a system Adela had not requested, but found she could not object to. The letter came up because of the bureau. Edmund kept everything in that bureau, Constance said, nodding toward the sitting room, with the familiarity of someone who has been in this house many times, and 30 years of correspondence, filed and cross-referenced. I asked Adela whether the police had looked through it, and she said they hadn't asked. I told them it was there, Adela said. She was at the table with both hands around a mug of tea, looking at the middle distance with the abstracted quality she had maintained since Thursday, present, functional, but operating from some interior remove. Inspector Colford said they would send someone. They haven't, Constance said crisply. And there's a letter in the front drawer, not filed, just sitting there loose, which is not like Edmund at all, that I think someone ought to know about. Miss Marple looked up from her soup with the expression of a woman mildly curious about administrative matters. How curious, she said. An unfiled letter does seem rather unlike him. Constance nodded sharply, satisfied to be agreed with. It's from Geoffrey Ryland. The letter was dated the 14th of September, 6 weeks before Edmund's death. Constance brought it from the bureau in its envelope, holding it by the edge with the residual habit of someone trained never to contaminated evidence, and laid it on the kitchen table. Miss Marple read it without touching it, leaning forward with her reading glasses, which she produced from her cardigan pocket with the practised ease of long use. It was handwritten, 3 paragraphs, in the compressed and controlled script of a man who has composed his words with considerable care. The first paragraph opened with a formal reference to their previous conversation in the lane in March. The second stated, plainly and without ornamentation, that Geoffrey Ryland had become aware of certain information regarding the Rookery Path reclassification application, information which, he wrote, pertained not merely to the path itself, but to the land title records filed at the district registry in 1987, and that he believed Edmund should be made aware that proceeding with the application would require those records to be reviewed in full. The third paragraph was 3 sentences. The first said that he had no wish to cause unnecessary difficulty. The second said that he was sure Edmund understood the implications. The third wished him well. Miss Marple straightened and removed her glasses. "Land title records," she said, to no one in particular. "I don't know what that means," Constance said. "I'm not certain I do either," Miss Marple replied, which was the most comfortable position to occupy until she was more certain that she did. She telephoned Mrs. Lamb that evening on the pretext of returning a call she had not, in fact, missed, and after 6 minutes of preliminary conversation, directed the exchange, with the gentle inevitability of water finding a channel, toward the subject of local land records. What she learned required some patience to extract, as Mrs. Lamb's knowledge of the matter was thorough but non-linear. The substance of it was this. In 1987, a boundary adjustment had been filed at the district registry relating to properties at the northern end of Chipping Barrow. The adjustment had been minor on paper, a matter of several yards along the rookery's eastern edge, and had been processed without objection, as such things often were when both parties signed. Both parties, in 1987, had been the Pryce estate and the Ryland family, who had purchased Witton the previous year. Both parties had signed. What Geoffrey Ryland's letter implied, and it only implied, it did not state, because Geoffrey Ryland was a careful man, was that the 1987 adjustment, when examined in the context of Edmund's current reclassification application, would reveal something that made the application complicated. Something that Edmund had perhaps not thought through, or had thought through, and believed no one else would pursue. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Lamb warmly and rang off. She sat for a long time afterward, with the brown notebook open on her knee, not writing in it. Outside, the October evening settled into the village with its customary patience. The implication, as she worked it through, was this: Geoffrey Ryland had known something about the land title that could have undermined Edmund's path application. Rather than deploy this information publicly, at the parish council through a solicitor, he had written to Edmund privately. He had, in effect, offered him a warning. A warning was not a threat, but it was not entirely distinct from one. Edmund had not withdrawn the application. He had kept the letter, loose and unfiled, which meant he had read it recently, more than once, and had not resolved what to do with it. And 3 weeks after Ryland's implied deadline had presumably passed without response, Edmund Pryce had been found dead at the second stile, 40 yards from Geoffrey Ryland's garden gate. Miss Marple closed the notebook. She thought about the binoculars on the conservatory shelf, worn and practical, as she thought about the gate in the yew hedge. She thought about a careful man who preferred not to state things directly. And then she thought about Adela, who had said, "I always have." 2 people, she reflected, who had learned to wait. The question was which one had stopped. Chapter 7. The Wrong Conclusion. Inspector Colford found the land records on Monday morning, which was 48 hours after Miss Marple had already understood their significance, and he arrived at a conclusion that was logical, well supported, and incorrect in the one specific way that mattered most. He had found the letter in the bureau himself. A constable had finally been sent to the Pryce house on Sunday evening, as Constance Veal had demanded with increasing firmness, and had read it with the careful attention of a man trained to follow what evidence presents, rather than what it withholds. By 9 on Monday, he had the 1987 land registry records on his desk, had spoken twice with the district planning office, and had driven to Whitton at 10:30 with Sergeant Hewitt, and the expression of a man who believes he is about to have a productive conversation. Geoffrey Ryland admitted him without visible alarm, which Colford noted and interpreted as confidence. It was, he would later reflect, a reasonable interpretation that happened to be pointed in the wrong direction. The interview lasted 50 minutes. Colford established the following facts, which were all true. Geoffrey Ryland had written the letter. Geoffrey Ryland had been aware, as a retired land surveyor with professional familiarity with the district registry, that the 1987 boundary adjustment created a complication for Edmund's reclassification application, specifically that a strip of land along the Rookery's eastern edge, which Edmund was treating as unambiguously his, had a registered title that the 1987 filing made, at minimum, contestable. If Edmund had proceeded with the application, the full review would have exposed this, potentially at considerable legal cost to the Pryce estate. Geoffrey Ryland had not informed the parish council of this. He had written privately to Edmund. Edmund had not responded. Geoffrey Ryland had, on his own account, been at Whitton all of Thursday morning. He had been in the conservatory between 7 and 9, he said, tending to his seedlings, but he had not gone out through the garden gate. He had not been on Rookery Path. Colford asked about the binoculars. Ryland confirmed they were his, confirmed he used them regularly for bird-watching in the rookery, and confirmed that from the conservatory window one could see the upper section of the path. "Did you observe anything on Thursday morning?" Colford asked. Geoffrey Ryland was quiet for a moment. A considered pause, the kind that precedes a careful answer rather than a constructed one. "I saw someone on the path," he said, "early, before 7:30, I think, walking north." Hewitt looked up from his notebook. "Man or woman?" Colford asked. "I couldn't say with certainty. The light was poor, dark coat moving quickly." He paused again. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. People use the path." "And you waited until now to mention this. You hadn't asked me directly until now." He said it without apology, which was somehow more convincing than if he had offered one. Colford drove back to Barrowbridge with what he believed was a motive, a threat, and a witness who had seen someone on the path, someone in a dark coat moving quickly before the time of death. He also had, as he told Hewitt on the drive, a man with access to the path from his own garden, a professional understanding of exactly how much was at stake, and a private letter that Edmund Pryce had chosen to ignore. He was, Hewitt agreed, the obvious candidate. "The question," Colford said, "is whether a letter constitutes sufficient grounds for a man of 68 to commit murder over a land boundary dispute." "People have done worse for less," Hewitt said, which was accurate but not specific. Colford nodded, tapping the steering wheel. The logic held. Ryland had warned Edmund privately. Edmund had ignored him. and if the application had proceeded to full review, the contestable boundary would have become a matter of public record, and potentially a matter of litigation that Ryland, on a surveyor's pension, could ill afford to sustain. Motive was present. Access was present. The figure in the dark coat was unidentified and convenient. The case, Colford felt, was acquiring a shape. Miss Marple heard about the interview from Constance Veal, who had heard it from Constable Marsh, who had not been present but had spoken with Hewitt, and who had conveyed the substance of it with the unconscious editorial additions that information acquires as it travels through a village. By the time it reached Miss Marple on Monday afternoon, it included the detail that Colford was all but certain about Geoffrey Ryland, which was either Hewitt's private opinion or Marsh's embellishment, but which was not, Miss Marple suspected, significantly distant from the truth. She set down her knitting and thought about this for several minutes. The difficulty was not that Geoffrey Ryland lacked motive. The difficulty was that the motive pointed to precisely the wrong emotional register. A man who writes a private warning letter, careful, indirect, or offering the other party a dignified exit, is not a man who then creeps through a garden gate in poor morning light and commits a violent act at a muddy stile. The letter and the crime required two entirely different architectures of temperament. Unless, of course, the letter had not been written as a warning at all. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, worked 3 stitches, and stopped. What if the letter had been written as a record? Not to warn Edmund, not to threaten him, but to establish, in writing, that Ryland had attempted to resolve matters through proper channels, before something happened that required a paper trail. Before, not after. She put the knitting down entirely. If the letter was a record made in anticipation of Edmund's death, then Geoffrey Ryland had not killed Edmund Pryce, and he had known someone else was going to, or he had known someone else wanted to, and had decided to let them. Chapter 8. The First Mistake. The person Miss Marple should have spoken to first was not Geoffrey Ryland, and not Marcus Armitage, and not Constance Veal, with her efficient management of other people's grief. It was a woman named Dorothy Pryce, who had been Edmund Pryce's secretary for 11 years, at the Barrow Bridge solicitor's office, where he had worked before his retirement, and who now lived in a small bungalow on the Fernley Road with a cat and a vegetable garden, and a memory, Miss Marple suspected, considerably more complete than anything contained in Edmund's bureau. She had not spoken to Dorothy Pryce because Dorothy Pryce had not appeared in any conversation, which was, is she now recognized with the mild self-reproach of a woman who expects better of herself, precisely why she should have sought her out immediately. The people who do not appear in village conversations about a dead man are either entirely peripheral or entirely central, and the distinction is worth establishing early. Dorothy Pryce was 61, small and neat, with close-cut grey hair, and the watchful composure of someone who had spent a professional lifetime knowing things she was not at liberty to discuss. She received Miss Marple on Monday afternoon with a courtesy that suggested she had been expecting a visit from someone, if not specifically this someone. "I wondered," she said, pouring tea with the unhurried precision of a woman who does everything at the pace she has decided upon, "how long it would take." The sitting room was orderly without being stark, books arranged not by colour or height, but apparently by a system private to their owner. A single good watercolour above the fireplace. A cat on the windowsill performing the elaborate indifference that cats employ when they are, in fact paying close attention. Miss Marple accepted her tea and settled comfortably and waited, because Dorothy Paish was the sort of woman who would say what she intended to say at the moment she had decided to say it, and any attempt to accelerate that process would only produce resistance. "I worked for Edmund for 11 years, Dorothy said, sitting opposite with her cup balanced neatly on her knee. "Solicitor's secretary, which means I knew a great deal about a great many people's affairs. I am not in the habit of discussing what I know." "A very sound habit," Miss Marple said warmly. "In any profession, really." However, Dorothy looked at her steadily. "Edmund is dead, and the manner of it, I have been reading the police information very carefully. What's available suggests that allowing habit to take precedence over conscience would be a choice I would find difficult to justify to myself." "That is a very honest way of framing it," Miss Marple said. Dorothy set her cup on the side table. "Edmund Pryce was not a good man," she said with the flat calm of someone delivering a professional assessment. "He was intelligent, organized, and capable of considerable charm when charm served his purpose. He was also a man who used information as currency, and who had, over a very long career, he accumulated a great deal of it." Miss Marple did not respond to this. She let it rest in the room. "The path application," Dorothy continued, "was not about the path. It was not about the fence, or the Ryland Conservatory, or any of the individual matters he pursued. Those were instruments. Edmund's real interest in all of it was the rookery itself. The land, not the path across it, the copse. The oak timber alone, at current prices, is worth considerably more than most people in this village would calculate." Miss Marple thought of the rookery, the dense, quiet copse of oak and ash, the flat grey October light through the remaining canopy. She thought of a retired land surveyor's binoculars on a conservatory shelf, and the 1987 boundary adjustment, she said gently. "And was that relevant to the timber?" Dorothy looked at her with an expression of measured respect. The 1987 adjustment placed the eastern strip of the rookery into an ambiguous position. Edmund knew this. He had always known this. He processed the paperwork himself, in his capacity as conveyancing clerk before he qualified. He structured the ambiguity deliberately. The intention, I believe, was always to pursue the land claim when the moment was advantageous. The path application was simply the mechanism to force a full title review in circumstances he controlled. The room was very quiet. The cat on the windowsill shifted one paw and resettled. "He told you this?" Miss Marple asked. "He told me nothing directly. He never did. But 11 years of filing correspondence, preparing letters, or observing which documents were brought out at which moments," she paused. "One learns to read an accumulation." Miss Marple walked home by way of the Fernley Road and through the upper lane, which brought her past the northern entrance to Rookery Path and the Ryland Gate in the yew hedge. She walked slowly, even by her own standards. The shape of it was clarifying. Edmund had spent years, perhaps decades, constructing a position from which he could claim a portion of the rookery's timber rights. The path application had been his chosen instrument. But it had also been, she now understood, his first mistake. Because forcing a full title review did not merely expose Ryland's complication. It exposed Edmund's own 1987 manipulation. And Geoffrey Ryland, as a retired surveyor who had lived at Whitton for 37 years, had eventually read the same accumulation Dorothy Paish had read. Which meant Ryland's letter had not been a warning. It had been a declaration. I know what you built in 1987. I have always known. Edmund had not responded because he had not known how to respond without admitting the manipulation. He had been, for perhaps the first time in 40 years, outmaneuvered. And then he had died. Miss Marple paused at the Ryland gate and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked north, toward the upper stile. She was, she recognized, still thinking about this incorrectly. She had been arranging the men, Ryland, Armitage, Edmund himself, like pieces on a board, following the property lines and the legal implications and the 40-year accumulation of deliberate wrong. It was all true. It was all relevant. But she had made the same error she had observed in Inspector Colford. She had followed what the evidence presented rather than what it withheld. The evidence had been withholding one person's name from the very beginning. Not because that person was invisible, because they had made certain of it. Miss Marple turned and walked home considerably faster than she had arrived. Chapter 9. The Trap on Thursday. Miss Marple spent Tuesday doing 3 things that appeared, to anyone observing her, to be entirely unrelated. She attended the Tuesday morning meeting of the Chipping Barrow Horticultural Society, which convened in the church hall, and which she had not attended in 6 weeks, due to what she described as a troublesome knee. She sat in her usual chair, contributed a brief observation about overwintering dahlias, and listened with every appearance of pleasant attention to 40 minutes of discussion she was not following. She then walked to the post office, sent 2 letters by first class, and purchased a jar of local honey she did not need. In the afternoon, she telephoned Inspector Colford. Colford received the call with the particular weariness of a man who has been receiving calls from village residents all week, and has found precisely none of them useful. Miss Marple, he knew from experience and reputation, was not quite in that category. She had, on 2 previous occasions in his career, said things that had rearranged his thinking without his entirely consenting to the rearrangement. He was therefore wary of her in the specific way one is wary of a door that has previously opened unexpectedly. She did not, on this occasion, offer him a theory. She offered him a suggestion. "I wonder," she said in the pleasant conversational tone that was her most effective instrument, "whether it might be worth speaking again with Adela Pryce. Not about the bureau, or the letter. I imagine you've covered those thoroughly. But about the morning routine. Edmund's specifically. Who knew the precise timing of his walk, the exact route, which stile he always crossed first?" Colford said that they had established Edmund walked the path daily at 7. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but who knew he always rested at the second stile? He had a habit, you see. His knee in damp weather gave him trouble. He would stop at the second stile and rest for several minutes before descending to the lower meadow, every morning without variation. I heard this from Adela directly." She paused. "It seems to me that whoever positioned themselves to strike him would need to know not merely that he used the path, but precisely where he would be stationary, for long enough." A silence from Colford's end. "You're saying the positioning was planned?" "I'm saying it required specific knowledge. The sort of knowledge that comes from very close observation over a very long time." Another pause, perfectly timed. "Or from living with someone." She thanked him and rang off before he could ask her anything further. What she had not told Colford was what she intended to do on Thursday morning. The 2 letters sent from the post office had been, respectively, to Adela Pryce and to Geoffrey Ryland. Both were handwritten, both brief, and both contained the same essential information. that Miss Marple had spoken with Dorothy Pryce and had come to understand the full significance of the 1987 land records, and that she believed the matter ought to be discussed quietly before the police arrived at certain conclusions through official channels. She suggested Thursday morning at 10 at her own cottage. To Adela she added one sentence. I think Edmund's walking stick deserves a conversation of its own. To Geoffrey Ryland she added a different sentence. I believe you saw rather more on Thursday morning than you felt able to tell Inspector Colford. She sealed both envelopes, addressed them in her careful hand, and posted them before she could reconsider. Not because she was impulsive. She was constitutionally the reverse of impulsive, but because she had learned, over many decades, that the most dangerous moment in any trap is the interval between setting it and springing it, and that the correct response to that interval was decisive action, followed by patient waiting. She was very good at patient waiting. Wednesday passed without event. Miss Marple gardened in the morning, read in the afternoon, and went to bed at 10 with the focused calm of a woman who has arranged everything she can arrange, and intends to sleep soundly before the morning requires her to be entirely alert. She slept soundly. Thursday arrived with flat white cloud, and the particular stillness of a cold English morning that has not yet decided what it intends to become. Miss Marple was up at 6:30, dressed by 7, and had made a Victoria sponge by 9, which served two purposes. It gave her something purposeful to do with her hands during the intervening hours, and it provided the table with the appearance of a social occasion rather than an interrogation. She set out 3 cups. At 5 minutes to 10 she heard the gate. It was Adela who came first, which was not unexpected. Adela Pryce had always been the more decisive of the two. Miss Marple had understood this from the first visit, from the way she had poured tea without being asked, from the way she had answered questions before they became pointed. She arrived in her dark winter coat, composed and upright, and accepted Miss Marple's greeting, with the careful warmth of a woman attending a meeting she does not yet know the agenda for. She sat at the table and looked at the 3 cups. "Are we expecting someone else?" she asked. "Mr. Ryland," Miss Marple said. "I thought it might be useful." Something crossed Adela's face. Not quite alarm, not quite recognition, but the brief, involuntary reorganization of an expression by a person managing the gap between what they know and what they are prepared to acknowledge. It lasted less than a second. Then she was composed again, hands folded, coat still buttoned. "I see," she said. Miss Marple poured tea and offered sponge, and talked pleasantly about the difficulty of late-season gardening. And Adela responded in kind. And the 2 women sat in the comfortable warmth of the cottage kitchen, making conversation of remarkable surface normality. And beneath it, the air had the quality of the Rookery in October, held and very still, and waiting for something to move. The gate opened again at 4 minutes past 10. Chapter 10. What the Stick Knew. Geoffrey Ryland came in without hesitation, which told Miss Marple everything she needed to confirm. A guilty man hesitates at a threshold. A man who has been carrying a secret he is ready to release walks through a door as though he has been waiting for it to open. He saw Adela. The look that passed between them lasted no more than 3 seconds, and contained, Miss Marple thought, the compressed weight of approximately 18 months. It was not the look of conspirators. It was something considerably more complicated and considerably sadder. He sat down Miss Marple poured his tea. She offered sponge. He declined. Adela had not touched hers. "I expect," Miss Marple said pleasantly, setting the teapot down and folding her hands, "that you are both wondering precisely how much I know." Neither of them answered, which was its own kind of answer. "I know about the 1987 adjustment," she said. "I know Edmund structured it deliberately to create a future claim on the Rookery timber. I know that you, Mr. Ryland, understood this, not recently, but some years ago, and that your letter in September was not a warning to Edmund, but a statement of your own position, that you intended to contest it if he proceeded." She looked at Adela. "And I know that you, Adela, have known about the timber scheme for considerably longer than you have indicated to anyone." Adela's hands tightened fractionally in her lap. "Edmund told me," Adela said. Her voice was even. "7 years ago, he was rather pleased with himself, and he had been waiting 30 years for the right moment, and believed it had finally arrived." She paused. "I told him it was wrong, that the 1987 filing had been done dishonestly. He said that was a matter of perspective." "And the path application?" Miss Marple asked. "I tried to stop it. I argued, which was never effective with Edmund, and then I wrote to Geoffrey." She said the name without self-consciousness, which told Miss Marple that this was not a recent acquaintance. "I told him what Edmund intended. I thought if Geoffrey could demonstrate he knew about the 1987 manipulation, Edmund might abandon the application quietly, rather than risk exposure." "Which is why Geoffrey's letter existed," Miss Marple said. "You suggested it." Ryland spoke for the first time since sitting down. "She told me what Edmund had done in 1987. I had always suspected something was irregular about the boundary, but I hadn't pursued it." When Adela explained the full extent of it, he stopped. "I wrote to Edmund, as she suggested." "Edmund did not abandon the application," Miss Marple said. "No," Adela said. "He found it amusing, I think, that Geoffrey had put his position in writing. He said it actually helped him, that if Geoffrey contested the claim, it would force a review that Edmund believed he could still win, because he had structured the 1987 documents very carefully." She looked at her tea. He was not a man who accepted the possibility of losing. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then she said in the same pleasant, unhurried tone, "Will you tell me about Thursday morning, Adela?" The kitchen was very still. Adela did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression had not crumbled. It had simply changed register, from controlled to something more directly honest, as though a piece of careful performance had been set aside because it had ceased to serve its purpose. "He went out at 7, she said, as always. I watched from the bedroom window until he turned onto the path. Then I put on my coat and followed him. Through the lower lane, not the path itself, I came up through the lower meadow gate. I had decided to speak to him, one final time, about withdrawing the application. You knew he stopped at the second stile, every morning. For 4 years, since his knee worsened, he would stand at the stile and look out over the meadow for 5 minutes. He said it was the only time in his day when he felt entirely himself." She said this without irony, as though the observation contained considerable irony. "I came up from the lower meadow. He was there at the stile, as I knew he would be. We argued, properly, this time. I told him I had written to Geoffrey, that Geoffrey knew everything, that the application would destroy what was left of his reputation. He became very angry, She stopped. "He raised the stick," she said quietly. He had never done that before. In 38 years, he had never raised a hand to me. I don't know if he intended. I don't know what he intended. I stepped back. He was turning, and a pause of absolute precision. He caught the top of the stile post with his temple, the loose one. He went down very quickly. Miss Marple said nothing. "He was already gone," Adela said. The post had the iron bracket still on it. It was immediate, and there was nothing to be done. She looked at her hands, which were entirely steady, which was perhaps the most telling thing about them. I stood there for some time. Then I moved the stick. I had been holding it. I had picked it up when he raised it. I placed it against the post, and I walked back through the lower meadow. And I was home and in the kitchen before 8:30. The room held this for a long moment. Geoffrey Ryland had been watching Adela throughout this, with the expression of a man hearing a version of something he had already partially constructed. His binoculars, Miss Marple now understood, had not seen the death itself. He had seen Adela's departure, the figure in the dark coat moving south, lighter and faster after the pause. He had understood what the pause might mean, and he had said nothing because he had written that letter, and because he understood. As a man who had known Adela Pryce for 18 months of correspondence about her husband's wrongs, that the version he was protecting was not simple guilt. "You moved the stick to the left side," Miss Marple said, "because you were holding it in your left hand when you picked it up, and you set it down on that side without thinking. A small thing, the only thing that did not fit." Adela nodded once. "Edmund was right-handed. I should have remembered." Inspector Colford arrived at 10:30, having received that morning a letter from Miss Marple, a third letter posted Tuesday alongside the other two, which had asked him, with considerable tact and some precision, to come to her cottage on Thursday at 10:30, where she believed a conversation of significance would be concluding. He found 3 people at a kitchen table, a Victoria sponge largely untouched, and a case that had arranged itself with the kind of quiet, devastating completeness that he had in 26 years encountered perhaps twice before. Miss Marple poured him tea without being asked.